Good morning. It's good to see you this morning. I'm very happy to be here. I'm glad that your furnace works this morning. That's a good thing. I know many of you, and many of you know me, but I'd like to just share a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Iowa. I grew up north of Mason City, so about 90 miles east of here. My wife is from Lake Mills. We both attended Waldorf College in Forest City, and I met her while I was in high school. We were high school sweethearts. Many of you know her. Bev Nappe, she apologizes for not being able to be here this morning. She plays in the praise band at Harbor of Joy up in Milford, and was supposed to be serving lunch this morning. So she thought she'd better stay and fulfill those responsibilities. But she sends her greetings to you. After we attended Waldorf, I went to Concordia College in Moorhead for a couple of years. Then I was youth director in northern Minnesota for a couple of years in Hibbing, and it gets cold up there too. So we had several Sundays in January that we were up there where the warmest that it got was 20 below. So we're familiar with this weather. Moorhead gets pretty cold too. But we had our first congregation in South Dakota in a little town called Toronto. We were there for 7 years. Then we were down in Jewell serving congregation down there. We followed Lee. He was pastor in Jewell, and when he left after a vacancy, we took up and tried to follow in his footsteps the best we could. So, and then he kind of followed in our footsteps. We were at Waldorf, and then he served in Forest City when he left Jewell. So we've kind of followed a parallel track. When after we had been in Milford for a few years, then he shows up at the Bible camp, and we've kind of shadowed each other throughout the years. What I'm here to tell you about this morning is reaching the unreached, and that's the new adventure that Bev and I are on. We have been involved with reaching the unreached for about 6 years now, and the first few years we spent doing it on the side as kind of a hobby. It was started over 20 years ago by a couple named Rodney and Melinda, and I'll show you their pictures here in a few minutes. I got to figure out how this works. It works. The passage that we had, or a couple of the passages, the Psalm 67 passage is a prayer from King David appealing, may all the people praise you. All the people around the world, not just our family and friends, not just our community, but God's desire is for all the people of the world to get to know him. Our gospel lesson, Jesus left those words with his disciples as the Great Commission, calling each of his disciples to go wherever the Spirit leads. Like I mentioned with the kids, whether that's across the street or across the ocean, to go and share the good news of what God has done so that all the people will know him and praise him. And then that passage from the book of Revelation, the vision that God gave to the Apostle John of every tribe, every nation, every people, of all colors, all languages, standing before the throne of God in eternity, praising him, lifting up their voices to honor our God and Creator. That's the vision that our scripture ends with. It's a hope that we look forward to, but it's also a challenge given to his people. We're not at that point yet in our world where all the people have come to know who Jesus Christ is. And this picture reminds me, I've been searching for a couple of years trying to find the exact picture that I once saw. It's in the fellowship hall of a church in Austin, Minnesota. And if I drive past there sometime, I'm going to stop and take a picture of it so I can put it in here. But I was attending a funeral there a couple of years ago, and this picture was much bigger with many more faces, dressed in ethnic outfits, different colors, different languages, different backgrounds, all standing before the throne of God. It's a picture of that passage from the book of Revelation. As God enjoys hearing the praises of all his people. That's the challenge, the commission, the vision that we have, and that we're called to fulfill during our life, so that in eternity we can join our voices with all those people. This is the area where Bev and I go. We have been traveling there. We've been there 6 years in a row in September. That was the tradition that our predecessors set up, that they visited in September. For the people there, it's their rainy season. And it's a good time for us to visit the leadership, the pastors and evangelists of that area, because their congregations, rain is a little scarce. So in the rainy season, when the rain comes, everybody goes to the fields and they start planting their seeds. And so the pastors, there's nobody around to talk to. They're all out in the field. So it's a good time for them to go to their theological conference, and that's what we try to provide. We go there for a couple of weeks and provide teaching and guidance and encouragement to the pastors and missionaries. These are all men and women who are from this area, and they enjoy hearing from us. They report on what they've been doing and the progress that they've seen, and we spend a couple of weeks in worship, in prayer, and in mutually encouraging one another. This is a close-up of that area. The primary country that we visit is Ghana. That's the bulk of that picture to the left. It's about the size of South Dakota or Nebraska if you turn it on end. That's about the geographical size. That little red strip to the right is a country called Togo, and about half of our missionaries are in Togo and half of them are in Ghana. And then we have one, if we go a little bit further to the west, Ivory Coast there is on the left. They prefer to call it Côte d'Ivoire. That's the French name for Ivory Coast. But if we zoom in a little bit, that black box is where I'll start introducing our pastors and missionaries. 200 years ago, when missionaries were going to Ghana, they would land on the coast. It's the southern coast there along the ocean, and the missionaries would get out of their boat, travel 20, 30, 50 miles inland, and start preaching. And the coast is pretty well evangelized. Most of the people along the southern coast are Christian. They've heard the gospel. And if you check in the almanacs or directories, most of them say that Ghana is a Christian nation. Well, the bulk of the population is there in the south, and most of them have heard the gospel. But the further inland you go, the more primitive it gets, the more remote it gets, and the less Christian it gets. As you move to the north, most of the people are either Muslim or they're called animist. They practice native religions. Voodoo originated in this part of the world, in Ghana and Togo. And most of the time we associate voodoo with the Caribbean. Well, with the slave trade, there was a huge slave market on the coast of Ghana where they would load up the ships with slaves, take them to the Caribbean, sort them out, and distribute them to who knows where. And so the practice of voodoo got transported to the Caribbean, but it originated here. These are three of the missionaries. In the upper right is Jonas and his family, and below him is Syriac, and then to the left is Yao. And each of these men have been sharing the good news in this area of Togo for 18 to 20 years. Syriac and Jonas, we have just purchased homes, mission houses for them, and they are going to be moving into their new homes this month. So we are excited about that. Yao is nearing retirement. His health has been fading, and we're trying to figure out where he's going to live and transition into retirement. As we move a little bit further north, we've got several families up here. The upper right is Francois. Below his picture is a woman named Rebecca. Rebecca lost her husband about 5 years ago. Emmanuel was killed in a motorcycle accident. The roads in this area are pretty primitive. Imagine if any of you have been on a field road out in the middle of your pasture, that would be a good road compared to what we have in Ghana. Most of the roads have eroded, or there's very heavy truck traffic. There's no limitation on the size of the truck like we might have here, and so the trucks are loaded 20, 30 feet high, along with being much longer than what we're used to here, and very heavy. They leave huge potholes. You could drop your car in a pothole. Lower right is Joseph, and on the left side is Everest and Moses. They too are some of our missionaries as we move west into northern Ghana. Upper right is a man named Kojo, who has been expanding his ministry across the border to the north in a country called Burkina Faso, which is a primarily Muslim country. And he has been expanding, has several churches now starting in Burkina Faso. Below his picture is Jacob, and then David in the middle. Upper left is Samuel, and below his picture is Paul. Each of these men have been trained as evangelists. What that means is our predecessors, Rodney and Melinda, went to Ghana and set up an evangelism training center. It was a 2-year program where these men came and were trained in fundamentals of Bible and Scripture, in evangelism techniques and sharing the gospel. They were given some preliminary pastoral ministry training and skills and how to set up a church. But the goal of Rodney when he set up Reaching the Unreached was to share the gospel with people who had never heard. And so these men were sent after 20 years now. They have done a good job, and many of them are serving 17, 18, 19, even 20 churches. And so they have disciples, students that they've been training and mentoring, and those disciples, there's no way that the evangelist can hit every one of those churches on a weekly basis. So he meets with his disciples during the week. They talk about the upcoming lesson. They plan a sermon together. Each of them together, they write and craft the sermon, and then they practice preaching it. And then the evangelist sends his disciples out to the various churches each week to proclaim that message. Moving a little further west, I mentioned we have one in Ivory Coast. His name is Pascal. Two in the northern part of this area, Robert and Samuel. And then a little bit further south, we have Stephen, Paul, Francis. Let's see. That is another Stephen, and above him is another Francis. This is the whole group, and when we when we meet together, we try to pull everyone together. They enjoy seeing each other. They only see each other when we gather as a large group for our conference. And so they look forward to that fellowship and encouragement and getting reacquainted with each other. We have two men who are year-round supervisors. You've met Ahmed, some of you. He has been here. I have a book back on our display table that Ahmed has written. He is a dynamic speaker. He travels around the world sharing how to reach out and evangelize Muslims. He is a former Muslim, was converted at about the age of 20 while he was in college. His father was very influential in Islam, and Ahmed was being trained as an imam, a religious leader within the Muslim religion. And he has memorized the Quran. He attended a madrasa, Islamic school, and that's part of what his book is about. He uses the Quran and verses from the Quran to convince Muslims that Jesus is the Messiah. And Muslim scholars don't like to debate him because he knows the Quran and also knows the Bible. So some of you who have heard him, he is hoping to be here again in June, and will be staying in Milford with us, and we'll try to set up a conference where he can share some more with those who are interested. Our other leader is Samson. He has also been in North Iowa. This is his wife, Janet. They were both here a couple of years ago, and it happened to be in April. And one of the first times that we mowed our lawn, Samson was enthralled with that lawnmower and said he wanted to try it. And once he got on it, we couldn't get him off. He mowed our whole lawn and enjoyed using the mower. His wife, Janet, thought she needed to do something too, so she grabbed a broom and was sweeping the grass so that Samson blew up on our patio. This was April, and it was about 60 degrees for us. We were enjoying it. It was finally warm. For her, she was cold. The usual temperature is upper 90s or easily over 100. We've been there when it's been about 115, and during the rainy season in September, things have cooled off a little bit. During the hot, dry season, it gets even warmer than that. This is Rodney and Melinda, the two who started Reaching the Unreached. They live in Lincoln, Nebraska, and over 20 years ago, it's about 23 years ago now, Rodney retired. He was a Lutheran pastor, and he was trying to just figure out, what am I going to do now that I'm retired? He and Melinda decided that they wanted to do a little traveling and some evangelism while enjoying their retirements. They traveled to China and to Russia and to Myanmar and places where the gospel is not really very welcome. In fact, they smuggled Bibles into Russia and China, and kind of got hooked, that they enjoyed going to places and proclaiming the gospel to people who had never heard it. They traveled to Ghana with another man who was a itinerant or traveling missionary, and decided to set up Reaching the Unreached. Part of the challenge was that in 1995, when they started this, there were 15,000 churches in northern Ghana who had no church, no Christian voice, no Christian witness. Those villages may range from a pretty good-sized town, size of Spencer or bigger, or that village might be, half a dozen huts with 40, 50 people. In northern Togo, there were 950 villages with no Christian witness. So they trained dozens of men and women in Ghana and Togo, and also had a ministry in India doing the same thing. They have an outreach to a tribe called the Banjara in India. Their goal was to train local men and women as evangelists and equip them to go and evangelize to their own people. They were going to need a means of support, and so Rodney and Melinda would come back to the United States and share that message with area churches and seek donations. And those donations would go to help pay the salaries and support these evangelists as they went to remote, distant areas to share the gospel. They trained over the years probably 50 to 70 men and women, 20 of whom are still working in the mission field. We have missionaries now in Ghana and Togo. We have disciples who have been trained who are ministering in Benin to the east, Burkina Faso to the north, and Côte d'Ivoire to the west. That includes over 180 churches. I think we're getting close now to 200 churches with over 10,000 people weekly worshiping in those churches who over 20 years ago did not know the name of Jesus Christ. 10,000 people. Each month, I receive updated emails from these pastors and their disciples, and especially at Easter and Christmas, they have mass baptisms where they ask people to come for training and education, and then they may baptize 20, 50, 70 at a time. Sometimes whole villages come and receive baptism. After a few years now, we're running into a problem, though. As I mentioned, these 20 pastors have done a good job and have raised up churches. If you do the math, 180 to 200 churches with only 20 evangelists, that is at least 10 churches apiece. How do we cover all the bases? Their mission was to evangelize. But now their time is being taken up administering churches. It's a different calling, a different mission to be an evangelist. It's different than being a pastor. And these men, they're outgoing, they're dynamic, they have kind of the temperament of the Apostle Paul, who sometimes says things that offend people. You need to be bold. You need to be willing to speak, especially in a Muslim or a native religion area where they don't want to hear your message. They have run into opposition. They've been run out of town. Paul was too. But you need to have that boldness, that temperament to proclaim the word fearlessly. Well, in a church, a pastor who does that usually doesn't last. That's a different kind of a temperament. A pastoral temperament is to be a shepherd, to be a soothing voice, to be comforting, to minister to people in their need. And so these men have been training their disciples to now take over the churches, to be pastors of those local churches so that these 20 can continue the work of evangelism, to go to a new place and proclaim the word where it hasn't been heard. So the problem we were running into is that there was no time left to be an evangelist because they were involved with church administration. These are some of the disciples. They're holding up a book that, along with their Bible, this book is called The Shepherd's Staff. It's written for students. It's kind of it's the seminary in a book, and the basic theological needs that these have. The evangelists go over the basics with them of theologically what faith is, what Christ accomplished on the cross, how we believe in him, how we're saved, what does it mean to be a Christian, what is the Bible, how does it nourish us, how do we grow. All of that is in this book, and that becomes their training manual. Many of these have been mentored by their evangelist for maybe 10 years. They have been serving as pastor apprentices, going and preaching in churches, doing the work of a pastor. And while we were there last September, we had the privilege of worshiping and ordaining 33 of these. So suddenly our mission has expanded. We went from 20 evangelists. Now we still have those 20. But now we also added over 30 pastors to the mix. This picture has two of them sitting there in the front row with their wives. This group, there's 14 who were commissioned as pastors. They're holding up a license, a certificate that we printed documenting that they've been recognized, called, and licensed to be a pastor among there in Ghana we're called the community churches. And so they are pastors of the community churches of Ghana and of Togo. This group is over 20 that were gathered. These are the Togo pastors who were commissioned. This worship service, with 20 of them being commissioned, our attendance was over 500 people that came from all a variety of churches. They came to gather and celebrate and rejoice. The service lasted about 4 hours as they rejoiced in these new pastors being called and commissioned to go out. So this is a picture of them holding up their documents. Their wives are kneeling in front of them. That's my wife. She's a different shade, different color than the rest of them. This is a worship service. Kojo is preaching. The churches are small. They're rustic. It's just a dirt floor. You notice there's some distance between the pastor and the front row of, if we take out this row of chairs, we'd have an area up front here, and that area is often filled during worship with dancers. That during worship, during the singing, the children might come up and they would dance to the music. Then they would go back and be seated. The women would come up and they would dance for a while. The worship and singing might last for half an hour. The women go back and sit down, and then the men would come up and they would dance as the singing and worship. They clap, they raise their hands, they rejoice, they shout. Worship is a full body experience. When they receive their offering, they set their offering plates where the baptismal font might be. They start singing, and they spend 10 minutes singing while the congregation dances up, puts their offering in the plate, and dances back. I've suggested that we give that a try, but I haven't had anybody take me up on that yet. Here's some of the dancers. They are rejoicing and singing and clapping and praising God with not just their voice, but with their whole body. The kids are seated on the floor over to the side. The praise band is primarily percussion instruments. The drums are there on the left. Here, this is the youth group, got up to sing a song. They all have matching t-shirts on. After worship in this place, we took a walk. We walked for about a half a mile from the church down to the local river. And along the way, we passed these women preparing their lunch. In the background, you see a cornfield. Corn, peanuts, beans, okra are some of the crops that are grown in that area. Sesame seeds are also grown. So there's a cornfield. They are able to get 2 crops a year. Here you see corn that's about maybe 18 inches tall, but below that they've also planted beans that they're double cropping here, that the corn will grow, they'll harvest that, and then they'll go back and get the beans as well. We got to the river. People lined up, and Rodney and Melinda were traveling with us. There were 16 who were baptized on this day, and we just went out into the river and were baptized. So that was a big celebration. 16 more who were added to the kingdom and who joined the congregation. Most of these are adult converts, having heard the gospel and deciding to come and join. This is a big decision, because especially if you're from a Muslim family, it means that you'll probably be ostracized. You'll be kicked out of your family. They will disown you, and sometimes they will beat you. Sometimes you have to relocate. You have to move out of the community because now you are spurned. You have not only shamed your family, but you have shamed your community. Just quickly, I'm running out of time here, but this is a Fulani village. This is Fulani are a nomadic tribe of people who travel with their cattle to wherever the grass is green, and the Fulani are credited with spreading Islam across North Africa. Because 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago, they were converted to Islam, and as they traveled, they shared their faith. So Islam spread across North Africa. Now we are reaching into the Fulani tribes. They're hard to reach because they don't stay in one place. You have to establish a relationship and either travel with them or have an ongoing connection with them. Jacob and his wife Alice are the ones who work with them most closely, but several of our other missionaries work with them as well. Even their huts, that's a grass mats that they build their homes out of, and when it's time to move on, they dismantle their house, roll up their grass mat, put it on one of their cows, and travel to the next place, and then put up a wooden frame and unroll their mats and put their house up. We meet with the chief. The normal practice is to meet and ask the chief for permission to address his people. The man there to the second from the left is the chief. We are presenting him with a gift. It's a bottle of Coke. We're handing it to him, greeting him, and asking if we can address his people. He gave us permission to do that. These are some of the women who are gathered. They like bright colors and are very expressive. As we shared the gospel with them, they were attentive. They listened. The women were much more interested than the men, especially with the men. They will be pretty harshly treated if they convert. The women there's fewer ramifications for the women. She might run into trouble with her spouse if she converts, but the women aren't treated as harshly if they listen. This is a whole village. Jonas is our missionary there in front in yellow. The chief is next to him. Jonas has asked the chief for permission to address the people. The chief consented. Jonas preached to the people. The whole village wanted to establish a church and wanted to become Christian. And so this is exciting. A whole village of people hearing the gospel and asking Jonas, come and start a church for us so that we can learn more. We want to hear more. And so this is Rodney and Melinda. They still live in Lincoln, Nebraska. They are still going out and visiting churches. In fact, Rodney was going to be visiting a church this morning. 3 weeks from tonight, or 3 weeks from last night, on March 23rd, we're going to have a banquet in Milford, actually in Arnold's Park at the Bible Conference grounds. And Rodney and Melinda are going to be our speakers to share with us about reaching the unreached and some of the history. And we're going to share more information on that night if you're interested in coming to a pork barbecue supper. That's going to be March 23rd. And again, another picture of different tribes, different nations, different languages, gathered in God's presence, rejoicing for all eternity. That's the vision. That's the challenge. God be with us. Thank you.